You know, sometimes life has a way of teaching you lessons you never saw coming. And let me tell you, at 62 years old, I've seen my share of family drama. But this one's gonna stick with you long after you finish reading it. It's about a young woman named Rachel, who discovered that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the very ones who'll try to tear you down. But here's the thing. She didn't just take it lying down. Oh no, what she did next will absolutely blow your mind. Picture this, a beautiful colonial home in Charleston, South Carolina, with white columns and wraparound porches that just scream Southern charm. That house held secrets, betrayal, and ultimately the most satisfying revenge story you'll ever hear. But before we get to the shocking twist that changed everything, let me tell you how it all began. And trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for this one, because what Rachel's father said about her will make your blood boil, but what she did about it, pure genius. Make sure you subscribe to hear more incredible family stories like this one every single day. Charleston, in late September, has this golden quality to the light that makes even the most ordinary moments feel magical. The Spanish moss drapes from ancient oak trees like nature's own curtains, and the air carries just a hint of salt from the harbor. Charleston's beauty had always felt like a rebuke to Rachel's modest upbringing. The historic mansions and manicured gardens seemed to whisper that some people were born to elegance, while others were destined to serve it. Inheriting grandmother's house had felt like finally being invited to a party she'd watched from outside her entire life. The house, at 1247 Magnolia Street, was everything you'd imagine when you think of Southern elegance. A three-story colonial with pristine white paint forest green shutters, and a garden that looked like it belonged in Southern Living magazine. Margaret Whitaker, Rachel's grandmother, had maintained this property for 47 years, and every inch of it showed her loving care. The house still smelled like her grandmother's lavender sachets and lemon oil, a comforting embrace that reminded Rachel of the only unconditional love she'd ever known. Rachel Morgan was 28 years old, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that held both determination and vulnerability. She'd built a respectable career as a real estate agent, specializing in historic properties throughout the Charleston area. But her success wasn't just professional achievement. It was proof that she could create value and stability in a world where her parents had taught her she was worthless. Every closed deal was a small victory against the voice in her head that echoed her father's words, "You'll never amount to anything." The pattern had started early. Rachel's first-grade teacher had called to praise her reading skills, but her parents focused on the teacher's mention that Rachel was shy and withdrawn. Every achievement became evidence of her inadequacy. Every success twisted into proof that she was putting on airs. James Morgan hadn't always been cruel. Rachel remembered fragments of a different father, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd worked double shifts to buy her a prom dress. But years of financial stress, failed dreams, and alcohol had eroded his better angels until only resentment remained. Linda, who worked sporadically as a cashier, had become his echo chamber, reinforcing his bitter worldview with passive-aggressive comments about how education was wasted on girls who'd just end up married anyway. Margaret Whitaker had seen the damage her son was inflicting on Rachel. During their last conversation, she'd gripped Rachel's hand with surprising strength. "Some people are takers, sweetheart. They'll drain you dry if you let them. This house isn't just an inheritance. It's your chance to choose yourself over their expectations." The inheritance had shocked everyone, especially James and Linda. Margaret's will was crystal clear. The house, valued at $950 went entirely to Rachel. The central challenge wasn't just inheriting a house, it was navigating the complex family dynamics that came with it, while her parents suddenly saw their daughter's good fortune as their own ticket to a better life. 3 weeks after the funeral, Rachel sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by her grandmother's photo albums and the mounting bills from Margaret's final medical expenses. The apartment felt even smaller, now cramped with memories and the weight of decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Her phone rang, and her mother's voice carried that particular tone that always made Rachel's stomach tighten. "Rachel, honey, we've been thinking. Your father and we've been struggling with the rent on this place, and with that big house just sitting empty." The opportunity presented itself, wrapped in guilt and family obligation. Her parents were facing eviction from their rental, and despite everything, Rachel couldn't bear the thought of them being homeless. "You know what, Rachel?" her father's voice came through the speaker. "For the first time in years, we feel like we can breathe. This house, it could give us hope again." Rachel found herself agreeing to let them move in temporarily, already knowing it was a mistake, but unable to resist the possibility that maybe finally she could earn their gratitude and love. Within a week, James and Linda had moved their belongings into the beautiful colonial home. Rachel established what she thought were clear boundaries. She would handle all property taxes, insurance, and major maintenance costs, since the house was legally hers. Her parents would contribute to utilities and groceries. She even helped her father find steady work at a local garage and connected her mother with Sarah Martinez, her college roommate, who managed a boutique downtown. Sarah, a social worker, had immediately recognized the manipulation patterns in Rachel's family dynamics. "You're not responsible for fixing them," Sarah had warned during one of their coffee meetings. "You can offer help, but you can't make them accept it in a healthy way." But Rachel was determined to make it work. The plans seemed reasonable. Her parents would have stability, she would have family harmony, and maybe they would finally see her worth. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. During her second visit, Rachel discovered her mother had rearranged the living room, completely moving her grandmother's antique furniture to the basement and replacing it with their old worn pieces from the rental. "It just feels more like home this way," Linda explained with a dismissive wave. "That old stuff was so stuffy anyway." Rachel felt something twist in her chest, but she swallowed her objections. After all, they were family. The first month brought subtle but significant changes that Rachel tried desperately to ignore. Her parents had begun referring to the property as "our house" when talking to neighbors and friends. When she gently corrected them, her father's face would darken with that familiar expression she remembered from childhood, the one that preceded lectures about gratitude and respect. During her weekly visits, Rachel observed her parents settling in with increasing permanence. They'd planted a vegetable garden without asking permission, installed a hot tub on the back deck, using money from her father's first paycheck, and even talked about getting a dog. Each change felt like another small claim on property that legally belonged to her. The attention from extended family and neighbors was overwhelming. Suddenly, relatives who had barely acknowledged Rachel's existence were calling to congratulate her parents on their beautiful new home. Aunts and uncles, who'd never shown interest in Rachel's life, were praising James and Linda for their good fortune. The Morgans basked in this newfound social status, hosting dinner parties and inviting friends over to admire their colonial mansion. Rachel's real estate career was flourishing partly because she was working longer hours to avoid confronting the growing tension at the house. She successfully negotiated a significant commercial deal, earning her largest commission to date. She was excited to share the news with her parents, hoping for once to receive their pride and support. Instead, her father's response was telling. "Well, that's nice, honey. Hey, your mother and I were thinking about taking that European vacation we've always dreamed about, to celebrate our new chapter in life." The hint was clear. Rachel found herself not just agreeing to fund their 3-month trip to Europe, but actually planning their itinerary, making reservations, and upgrading their accommodations in Paris and Rome. She told herself this generosity would finally earn their appreciation and respect. As they prepared for departure, Rachel helped them with everything from passport renewals to packing lists. She even arranged for a neighbor to check on the house while they were gone, though she planned to visit regularly herself. "You're such a good daughter," Linda said, as Rachel drove them to the airport. It was the closest thing to praise Rachel had heard from her mother in years, and she clung to those words like a lifeline. But even as she watched their plane taxi down the runway, Rachel felt an uneasy knot in her stomach. Something about their excitement felt wrong, as if they were celebrating more than just a vacation. 2 months into her parents' European adventure, Rachel had fallen into a routine of visiting the house twice a week to check on things and water her mother's plants. The house felt different without them, more like her grandmother's home, again filled with the peace and dignity that Margaret had cultivated over decades. Rachel was working late in her office on a Thursday evening when she decided to check her parents' social media posts from Paris. Her mother had been posting daily photos of their adventures, and Rachel enjoyed seeing them happy, even if their joy came at her expense. She was scrolling through Linda's Facebook page when she noticed a live video her mother had posted from a cafe. The video was mostly Linda showing off her croissant and coffee, but in the background Rachel could hear her father talking to someone off camera about the house situation and keeping Rachel manageable. Rachel's blood ran cold. She quickly started recording the live stream, her hands trembling as she captured what came next. "I'm telling you, Linda, this is working out better than we ever imagined." James's voice came through clearly as Linda moved the phone closer to their conversation. "Rachel's so desperate for our approval, she'll do anything we ask." "I know, right?" Linda's laughter was cruel and sharp. "Did you see how quickly she agreed to pay for this whole trip? The girl's such a burden, always trying to buy our love with her real estate money." Rachel's hand trembled as she held the phone, but she couldn't stop recording. She needed to hear this no matter how much it destroyed her. "The best part is she actually thinks that house belongs to her," James continued, apparently unaware that his voice was being broadcast live. "We've been living there for months, now making improvements, establishing residency. My buddy at the garage knows a lawyer who says we might have a case for adverse possession, or at least tenant rights. Plus, we've got all those photos of us hosting parties there, all the neighbors who know us as the homeowners." Linda added, "When we get back, we need to start working on getting her to sign some kind of partnership agreement. Make it official." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with her parents strategizing how to manipulate Rachel into essentially giving them the house. They discussed her emotional vulnerabilities, her desperate need for family approval, and how they could exploit her guilt and sense of obligation. "She's always been so easy to control," Linda said, taking a sip of her wine. "Remember when she wanted to go to that expensive college guilt trip about family loyalty, and she picked the cheaper school instead? And she still ended up with student loans we never helped her pay," James added with a laugh. But the words that cut deepest came near the end. "The funny thing is, she's always been such a burden to us, but now she's finally useful. That inheritance is the best thing that ever happened to this family. Well, to us anyway." Rachel sat in her dark office, tears streaming down her face, as she listened to her parents laugh about how easily they could manipulate their own daughter. The live video ended with Linda saying something about keeping this between us, apparently unaware that she'd been broadcasting their conversation to anyone who cared to watch. But alongside the heartbreak, something else was building. A cold, calculating anger that would fuel what came next. For weeks after hearing that conversation, Rachel would wake up in cold sweats, not from nightmares about her parents, but from dreams where they actually loved her. The fantasy was more painful than the reality. The decision to fight back wasn't born from anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This was born from something colder and more permanent, the recognition that some relationships are too toxic to survive. The next morning, Rachel walked into the office of Patricia Henley, one of Charleston's most respected family law attorneys. Patricia had built her practice, helping people escape financial abuse, and she recognized the signs immediately. "I see this more often than you'd think," Patricia told Rachel after reviewing the recorded conversation and legal documents. family members who view relatives as assets rather than people. The law is clear. You have absolute ownership of this property. But the emotional manipulation is what keeps victims trapped. The eviction process wouldn't be as simple as changing locks. Rachel had to formally serve notice, follow state tenant laws, and document everything carefully. Patricia warned her that even with clear ownership, removing family members could take months if they chose to fight. "We need to be strategic," Patricia advised. "Your parents have established residency, but they have no legal claim to ownership. However, if they refuse to leave voluntarily, we'll need to go through formal eviction proceedings." Rachel's plan began to take shape over 3 careful months, not the impulsive reaction her parents would later claim. She worked with a discreet real estate contact to identify potential buyers who could close quickly and quietly. She found the perfect match, David Chen, a relocating executive who needed immediate housing and was willing to pay $915,000 for a fast, off-market transaction. David understood boundaries because he'd had to set them with his own family. When Rachel explained her situation, he didn't offer advice or judgment. Instead, he said, "What do you need from me right now?" It was the first time anyone had asked her that question. The doubts crept in during those final weeks. Even as Rachel signed the preliminary sale papers, part of her hoped her phone would ring with her parents, calling to apologize, to prove that some small part of them actually loved her. The silence was its own kind of answer. Rachel found herself questioning whether she was overreacting, whether family loyalty should override her hurt feelings. She drove past the house one evening and saw evidence of their continued improvements. New shutters, a renovated front porch, landscaping changes that would have cost thousands of dollars. But then she would remember her father's voice, calling her a burden, her mother's cruel laughter, and their calculated plans to steal her inheritance. The doubt would evaporate, replaced by steely determination. The day of execution arrived with typical Charleston humidity and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. Rachel had taken the entire week off work, telling her colleagues she was handling family business, which was technically true. She began at dawn, using her key to enter the house, while her parents were still in Paris. Working with a team of professional movers, she'd hired Rachel carefully packed every item that belonged to her parents. She treated their belongings with more respect than they'd shown her, wrapping photographs carefully and ensuring nothing was damaged. The hardest part was packing away her grandmother's things. Each piece of furniture, every photograph carried memories of the woman who had believed in Rachel when her own parents didn't. Walking through the empty rooms, Rachel could almost hear Margaret's voice. A house becomes a home when it's filled with people who choose to love each other. The house sale closed at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Rachel signed the papers in Patricia Henley's office, officially transferring ownership to David. He was understanding about the situation and agreed to Rachel's request for a delayed possession date, giving her time to complete the transition. The final touch was a simple note, left on the kitchen counter where her parents would be sure to find it. Surprise! A burden did this. Your belongings are in storage unit 247 at Charleston Self-Storage on Rivers Avenue. Rent is paid for 3 months. Don't contact me. Rachel spent that evening in her apartment, packing her own belongings for the move to Richmond, Virginia, where she'd already secured a position with a prestigious real estate firm. She'd chosen Richmond specifically because it was far enough from Charleston to start fresh, but close enough to maintain her southern roots. The transformation was complete. The woman who had spent 28 years seeking her parents' approval had finally chosen self-respect over family obligation. Rachel's phone began ringing at 6:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours after her parents' flight had landed in Charleston. She let it go to voicemail, along with the 17 calls that followed throughout the day. The messages were a predictable progression through the stages of manipulative grief: confusion, anger, guilt-tripping threats, and finally desperate pleas for reconciliation. Rachel listened to each one with detached interest, as if studying a case study in emotional manipulation. The fallout extended beyond her parents. Aunts and uncles, who'd never shown interest in Rachel's life, suddenly had opinions about her cruelty and ingratitude. She lost relationships she'd thought mattered only to discover how little they actually had. Word spread through Charleston's real estate community about Rachel's family situation. Some colleagues admired her strength. Others whispered about her coldness. Rachel learned that setting boundaries often meant accepting that some people would never understand or approve. 3 days later, her parents found her new address through a mutual acquaintance and showed up at her Richmond apartment. Rachel watched from her window as they argued on the sidewalk below, her father gesticulating wildly while her mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She didn't answer the door. The confrontation Rachel had been preparing for finally came 2 weeks later. She agreed to meet them at a neutral location, a busy coffee shop in downtown Richmond, where their dramatic tendencies would be constrained by public setting. Rachel arrived first, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. She'd dressed professionally, carried herself with new confidence, and had her phone ready to record if necessary. When James and Linda walked in, they looked older, smaller somehow. The European vacation tan couldn't hide the stress lines around their eyes or the way they moved with less certainty than she remembered. Rachel's sweetheart, Linda, began reaching across the table. "We need to talk about this misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Rachel replied, calmly pulling out her phone. "Let me play something for you." The recorded conversation from Paris filled the space between them. Rachel watched her parents' faces change as they heard their own voices plotting against her, calling her a burden, laughing about their manipulation tactics. When the recording ended, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Her father's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, then something that might have been shame. "Rachel, you have to understand, we were scared. Scared of being homeless again." "You weren't scared," Rachel replied. "You were planning. You called me a burden while spending my money on a European vacation." The apologies that followed were textbook manipulation, minimizing their actions, shifting blame, appealing to family loyalty, and finally making promises they had no intention of keeping. Rachel had heard it all before, but this time she was prepared. She stood up, leaving money for her untouched coffee on the table. "I want you to understand something clearly. I am not your retirement plan. I am not your safety net, and I am certainly not your burden anymore." As she walked away, Rachel felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since childhood. The freedom that comes from finally setting boundaries that matter. 1 year later, Rachel stood in the garden of her new home in Richmond, a charming Victorian cottage that she'd purchased entirely with her own money and decorated according to her own taste. The house was smaller than the Charleston colonial, but it was completely undeniably hers. Success didn't erase the damage overnight. Rachel still found herself seeking approval from clients, still apologized for taking up space in meetings. But now she recognized these patterns and had tools to interrupt them. Therapy with Dr. Williams, who specialized in family trauma, helped Rachel understand that her parents' treatment hadn't been her fault, but healing from it was her responsibility. She learned that she could grieve the parents she'd needed while protecting herself from the parents she'd actually had. Her real estate career had flourished in Richmond, free from the emotional drain of managing her parents' expectations and manipulations. Rachel found herself more focused, more confident, and more successful than ever before. She'd started Building Foundations, a workshop series that helped people recognize and prevent financial manipulation within families. The workshop had grown from a small monthly gathering to a regional program that attracted participants from across Virginia and North Carolina. The Building Foundations workshop had helped 47 people in its first year. Rachel kept a photo wall of participants who'd successfully set boundaries with financially abusive family members. Each face reminded her that her painful experience had become a source of healing for others. Maria Santos had attended Rachel's first workshop 6 months after the house sale. At 65, Maria was supporting her adult son's drug habit while he lived in her basement, stealing her prescription medications and Social Security checks. Rachel's story gave Maria the courage to change her locks and her life. "I thought being a good mother meant never saying no," Maria had told the group. "But Rachel showed me that sometimes love means protecting yourself from people who would destroy you." Her chosen family had expanded to include colleagues who respected her expertise, friends who valued her authenticity, and her relationship with David had deepened into something beautiful and healthy. He understood both her ambition and her boundaries, having walked a similar path with his own family. The impact of her decision rippled outward in ways she hadn't anticipated. Several workshop participants had successfully extracted themselves from financially abusive family situations. Others had learned to set healthy boundaries before problems escalated. On the anniversary of selling the Charleston house, Rachel drove back to visit her grandmother's grave. She brought fresh flowers, magnolias, Margaret's favorite, and sat beside the headstone for an hour sharing updates about her new life. "I finally understand what you were trying to give me, Grandma," she said softly. "It wasn't just the house. It was permission to value myself enough to walk away from people who didn't." Standing in her grandmother's garden on the anniversary, Rachel understood that Margaret's greatest gift hadn't been the house. It had been permission to value herself enough to walk away from people who didn't. The inheritance wasn't money, it was self-worth. The sun was setting as Rachel walked back to her car, casting long shadows across the cemetery. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain of betrayal, the courage required to walk away from toxic relationships, and the joy of building a life based on self-respect rather than others' approval. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did the visit go? Dinner's ready when you get home." Home. The word carried new meaning now. Not just a place, but a feeling of safety, acceptance, and authentic love. Rachel smiled as she typed back, "On my way home." For the first time in her life, she truly understood what that word meant. If you found Rachel's story as powerful as I did, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every day we share real stories about families' courage and the strength it takes to choose yourself when it matters most. These aren't just stories, they're roadmaps for anyone who's ever felt trapped by family obligation or questioned their own worth. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect your future.